In the autumn of 1869, a Scott County, Virginia Circuit Court judge named Hector Payne authorized a grand jury investigation into the commercial activities of two brothers named Abner and Clem Raines, who had been operating a trading and brokerage business out of a property on Copper Creek in the southeastern corner of the county since approximately 1857. The investigation had been requested by the county sheriff, who had received, over the course of the preceding 2 years, a number of complaints about the Raines brothers' operation from individuals who had transacted with them and who described their transactions in terms that the sheriff had found consistently and troublingly similar across complainants who had no contact with one another. The terms were not the standard language of commercial fraud. The complaints did not describe misrepresentation of goods, or short waits, or failure to deliver purchased items, or any of the familiar forms of commercial dishonesty that a county sheriff in the 1860s, Mountain South, would have recognized and known how to address. The complaints described something that the complainants struggled to put into words, and that the sheriff, in his formal request to the judge, described as a category of transaction involving items of a nature I am not able to characterize in standard commercial terms, and involving effects on the complaining parties that I am not able to characterize in standard terms of harm or damage. A category of transaction, items of a nature not able to be characterized in standard commercial terms, effects not able to be characterized in standard terms of harm. The grand jury investigation produced an indictment on a charge that was, even by the standards of the period's creative use of existing law, unusual, the charge of obtaining property by means of deception of an extraordinary character, and produced a sealed exhibit bundle that the circuit court judge ordered sealed at the request of the grand jury, foreperson, on the grounds that the exhibits addressed matters that this jury has determined are better addressed in private proceedings than in public record. The sealed exhibit bundle has been in the Scott County Circuit Court records in Gate City since 1869. The accessible portion of the grand jury record, the indictment and the general characterization of the charges, is accessible to any researcher who requests it. Before we begin, drop your location in the comments and tell me what time it is where you are. Abner and Clem Raines traded in things that multiple complainants struggled to describe and that a county sheriff was not able to characterize in standard terms. I want to know where you are sitting when you hear what the accessible record establishes and what the sealed exhibits are described as containing. Scott County, Virginia in 1869 was a county fresh out of the Civil War's specific devastation of Southwest Virginia, a region that had been the theater of sustained guerrilla activity throughout the war, and that was, by 1869, in the condition of communities that had divided against themselves and were attempting the difficult work of reconstitution. The Copper Creek drainage in the county's southeastern corner was, by the end of the 1860s, a community in the particular state of flux that post-war Appalachian communities often found themselves in, familiar social structures disrupted, economic relationships reshaped, the mobility that the war had produced, bringing people through and into communities that had previously been more static. This was the environment in which the Raines brothers' trading operation had been established and had expanded. The context of post-war Scott County is important for understanding how the Raines brothers' operation could function for at least 12 years, from 1857 to the 1869 investigation, without generating official scrutiny earlier. The war had disrupted the ordinary networks of community knowledge and accountability that would normally have produced earlier complaints and earlier official attention. People had moved, died, or been otherwise displaced. The county's institutional mechanisms for addressing commercial fraud and community harm had been weakened and were in the process of being reconstituted. And the specific nature of what the Raines brothers were doing, whatever it was the kind of thing that people who experienced it found difficult to describe in ways that would generate official response. The complainants who eventually came to the sheriff had apparently been trying to find a form of words that worked for years before they succeeded. The sheriff had been receiving complaints that he found troubling but not actionable for 2 years before he felt he had enough to bring to the circuit court judge. The 12 years of operation before the investigation represented not a failure of the community's awareness of the problem, but a failure of the available vocabulary to translate that awareness into a form that official institutions could process. Abner and Clem Raines were, by the county record, substantial residents, landowners, taxpayers present in the census records from the 1850s onward. They were not marginal figures or newcomers. They had been in Scott County for decades and had established themselves as people of some standing before the war. Their trading operation, which they had formalized after 1857 with a specific property on Copper Creek that served as a combination, Residence and trading post was an extension of the kind of informal commercial activity that mountain county economies depended on, men who served, as intermediaries between the formal market economy of the county seats and the informal economy of the more remote communities, knew what people had and what they needed, and were willing to broker the gap between the two. What distinguished the Raines brothers' operation from the standard brokerage activities that characterized this role in mountain county economies was the nature of what they were brokering. The standard mountain county broker dealt in agricultural products, livestock, household goods, labor, the tangible and nameable commodities of a subsistence and cash crop economy. The Raines brothers dealt in those things too. The sheriff's complaint log over the 2 years preceding the grand jury investigation contains complaints about those standard transactions, short, weights, misrepresented goods, alongside the complaints that the sheriff found troubling. The troubling complaints were the ones that did not fit the standard categories. The complainants who described the non-standard transactions to the sheriff were, by the documentary evidence, attempting to describe something that they had experienced and that the vocabulary available to them for commercial transactions was not built to contain. They used language like, something I cannot describe as an object but that Clem Raines represented as having value, and a transaction in which what I gave and what I received were both of a kind that I cannot describe in ordinary terms. And, from one complainant whose account the sheriff recorded verbatim because it was the most specific he had received, Abner Raines told me he could help me with a matter that I could not bring to anyone else, a matter of a private nature involving something I had done and something that was owed on account of it. He told me he dealt in that kind of thing regularly and had done so for years. What he asked from me in exchange I gave him. What he gave me in return I cannot describe precisely, but I believed at the time of the transaction that I had received something of value. I believe differently now. A matter of a private nature involving something done and something owed on account of it, something given in exchange that cannot be described precisely. The grand jury heard testimony from 7 complainants and from 3 witnesses who had observed the Raines brothers' trading post operations without being parties to the non-standard transactions. The 7 complainants described, with the same consistency that the sheriff had noted in the complaint log, a set of transactions that the grand jury foreperson characterized in the accessible portion of the record as transactions involving things of an intangible or ineffable nature, the giving and receiving of which the complainants describe as having had effects on their persons and circumstances that they believe were consequential. The 3 observers described watching people enter and exit the Raines trading post in states that the observers characterized as different before and after the transaction, not different in any way that was observable in terms of physical condition, but different in the particular way that the observers found difficult to characterize, and that they described independently and in similar language as a change in quality rather than quantity. A change in quality rather than quantity. This was the language the grand jury foreperson used in summarizing the observer testimony. The accessible grand jury record does not define what is meant by quality in this context, and the sealed exhibits are described in the foreperson's summary as addressing this question directly. The charge of obtaining property by means of deception of an extraordinary character was entered against both brothers. Abner Raines was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in the Virginia State Penitentiary at Richmond. He served 3 years and was released in 1872. He returned to Scott County and appears in the 1880 census as a farmer on Copper Creek. He does not appear in the 1890 census. Clem Raines was acquitted. The jury found insufficient evidence for his specific role in the transactions, as distinct from his brothers, and continued to live on the Copper Creek property. He appears in census records through the 1900 enumeration and is recorded as dying in 1907 at an estimated age of 68. The sealed exhibit bundle in Gate City has been there since 1869. It contains the full testimony of the 7 complainants, the 3 observers, and what the foreperson described as documentary materials introduced by the prosecution that address the specific nature of the transactions in terms that the grand jury has determined are better handled in private proceedings. The accessible record, the indictment, the foreperson's summary, the charge characterization is in Gate City and accessible to researchers. The accessible record has been there since 1869 and has been reviewed by 2 researchers who have published brief references to it in works on Scott County history. Neither published reference addresses the specific nature of the transactions. There is a detail in the accessible grand jury record that addresses the question of what the transactions involved from a different angle. Complainant's testimony, which is the testimony of the 3 observers, the people who had watched individuals enter and leave the Raines trading, post without being parties to the non-standard transactions themselves. The observer's testimony is the least expected element of the case, because it establishes that the effects of the transactions were visible to someone who was not participating in them, a change in quality rather than quantity observable from outside. Whatever the Raines brothers were trading, it was not so private that its effects were invisible to a passerby. This is what distinguishes their operation from simple psychological manipulation, which would produce effects that were primarily internal to the person manipulated. What the observers saw, what they described, independently, in similar language, was an external change in the person exiting the trading post, something that was visible, something that a person who had had no transaction with the Raines brothers and had no prior knowledge of the transaction's content could nonetheless observe and describe, however imprecisely, as a change in quality rather than quantity. Today, the Copper Creek drainage in Scott County is rural and largely agricultural, substantially similar in its general character to what it was in 1869. The property where the Raines brothers' trading post stood has changed ownership many times. The specific structure was demolished at some unknown point in the late 19th or early 20th century. The Scott County Circuit Court records in Gate City are accessible to researchers through standard request processes. The sealed exhibit bundle is noted in the accessible record as existing and as sealed at the grand jury's direction. Whether the seal was intended to be permanent or was a temporary measure whose standard review period has long since passed without review is not established in the accessible documentation. Here is the question that the Raines brothers leave behind, and it is the most unsettling in this collection, precisely because the record cannot resolve it. 7 people came to the county sheriff and tried to describe what they had given and received in transactions with the Raines brothers, and the best they could manage was the language of things they could not describe, matters of a private nature, something given that cannot be described precisely. A sheriff with 20 years of experience characterized their complaints as addressing a category of transaction he was not able to place in standard commercial terms. A grand jury convicted Abner Raines of obtaining property by means of deception of an extraordinary character, a charge that the standard criminal law did not contain and that the court had to construct from existing frameworks. 3 observers described watching people enter and leave the trading post changed not in quantity but in quality. What were the Raines brothers trading? The sealed exhibits describe it in terms that the grand jury believed were better handled in private. The sealed exhibits have been sealed for 155 years. The question they answer is not recoverable from the accessible record. Was it psychological manipulation of the particular kind that exploits guilt and the desire to balance private moral accounts? Something I had done, and something owed on account of it? Was it a form of spiritual extortion operating in the specific language of mountain religious belief, where the sense of debt and obligation took a form that compliant victims genuinely experienced as transactional? Or was it something that the complainants, the sheriff, and the grand jury were collectively struggling to describe because what it was didn't map onto any of the categories available to them? The specific complainant whose account the sheriff recorded verbatim because it was the most specific he had received, the one who described a matter of a private nature involving something done and something owed on account of it, is the complainant whose experience most closely corresponds to what the charge of obtaining property by deception of an extraordinary character was apparently designed to address. The transaction he described was structured around something he had done, a private moral debt, and Abner Raines's representation that he dealt in that kind of thing regularly. This is the structure of what historians of folk tradition and popular religion sometimes call the debt transaction, a category of exchange that appears in multiple Appalachian cultural contexts, in which something of an intangible moral or spiritual character is represented as having exchangeable value. The Raines brothers may have been operating in the specific cultural vocabulary of their post-war mountain county community, in which guilt and moral debt were real categories with real weight, and in which the offer to help with such a matter was an offer that people took seriously and paid real prices for. This is the most historically grounded interpretation of what the accessible record describes. It does not fully account for what the observers saw from outside, the change in quality that was visible to people who had no part in the transaction. It does not account for the extraordinary character of the charge. It is the interpretation that fits the available framework most closely, which is not the same as fitting the available evidence most closely. Tell me in the comments what you think the Raines brothers were trading. Tell me whether you think the sealed exhibits answer the question or deepen it. There is one more element of the Raines case that the accessible record addresses and that has not been fully developed, the charge itself. Obtaining property by means of deception of an extraordinary character is not a charge that exists in any standard compendium of criminal law from the period. The circuit court judge who authorized the grand jury and the prosecutor who constructed the indictment had to work from existing fraud statutes and extend them to a case that those statutes were not designed to address. The extraordinary character language is the pivot on which the charge turns, the acknowledgement that what was involved was deception, but deception of a kind that required a new formulation because the standard formulations were inadequate. A circuit court judge in 1869 Virginia who authorizes an indictment using language he had to invent for the occasion is a judge who has concluded that what he is looking at is real enough and harmful enough to require the law to stretch to address it, even at the cost of constructing a charge that has no precedent. That is a significant judicial decision. It was made in 1869 in Gate City. The charge resulted in a conviction. Abner Raines served 3 years. If these grand jury records and sealed exhibit bundles and charges of deception of an extraordinary character and the things people describe as unable to be described are the reason you found this channel, subscribe and ring the bell. The accessible record is in Gate City. The sealed exhibits are in the Scott County Circuit Court records in Gate City, Virginia, in the same building as the accessible grand jury record, a few drawers over. The accessible record and the sealed record have been in the same building since 1869. The accessible record points at the sealed record. The sealed record has the answer. The building is open on county business days. The question is still open after 155 years. It is worth noting, in the interest of completing the picture that the accessible record provides, that the Copper Creek property where the Raines brothers operated was not in a remote or inaccessible location. It was on a named creek in a county that had been settled and farmed for decades before the brothers' operation began. The people who transacted with them were the Raines brothers' neighbors, people who lived within a day's ride, who knew the brothers by name, who had community relationships with them that extended beyond the trading post. The secrecy of the transactions was not the secrecy of geography. It was the secrecy of the specific content of what was exchanged. People came to Copper Creek and traded in something they could not describe, and then they went home to their farms and their families, and the effects of the transaction were visible to neighbors who had not participated in whatever the Raines brothers were offering and whatever people were giving in return. It was available on Copper Creek, and people knew it was available, and the circuit court in 1869 constructed a charge that did not previously exist to address it, and the sealed exhibits describe it in terms the grand jury believed were better handled in private. Something changed in the people who transacted with the Raines brothers. 3 observers said so, independently in similar language. A change in quality rather than quantity. The sealed exhibits say what it was. They have been saying it since 1869. Abner Raines came back to Scott County after his 3 years in the penitentiary and farmed on Copper Creek until he disappeared from the census records before 1890. Clem Raines farmed on Copper Creek until 1907 and died at an estimated 68 years old. The trading post on Copper Creek was closed by the 1869 proceeding and does not appear in any subsequent business record. Whatever the Raines brothers had been doing for 12 years on the Copper Creek property ended with Abner's conviction and Clem's acquittal, and the Scott County community went on without the availability of whatever the trading post had been offering, and the accessible record does not describe what the community's adjustment to that absence looked like. The sealed exhibits say what it was. They have been saying it since 1869. The question of what they say is the one that the accessible record, carefully read, points toward but does not answer. What changes in quality rather than quantity? What a complainant could not describe precisely but believed, at the time of the transaction, they had received as something of value. What made a circuit court in Southwest Virginia in 1869 construct a charge that did not exist in the standard criminal code to address something that did exist in the transactions of 2 brothers on Copper Creek? The sealed exhibits are in the Scott County Circuit Court records in Gate City, Virginia, in the same building as the accessible grand jury record, a few drawers over. The accessible record and the sealed record have been in the same building since 1869. The accessible record points at the sealed record. The sealed record has the answer. The building is open on county business days. The accessible record is in Gate City. The question has been open since 1869. In the accessible record in Gate City, pointing at the sealed exhibits in the same building, which have been saying the answer since 1869 to anyone who could read them.